Before I jump into the main topic of this video, I wanted to quickly shout out that I just put a new playlist on my YouTube channel homepage. The reason I'm shouting this out in this video is because this is actually the fourth entry to that playlist. A lot of times I get asked from people, what is like the best set of videos to watch from my channel to help them get better at Yu-Gi-Oh! And I've always had this idea in mind of these three videos that are currently in the playlist, and then I wanted to add this one right in there. So basically that playlist is going to be a Yu-Gi-Oh! Analysis for beginners and even intermediate players as well, and those videos are extremely helpful. If you watch a lot of competitive gameplay, or you're just getting into Yu-Gi-Oh! And you're a little confused why people are playing certain cards or saying certain things are good or certain things are bad, I think those videos are some of the most helpful ones on my entire channel. No, there's not the why nobody plays videos in there. I think those are important on a card by card basis, but as far as a broad spectrum of topics covered in just a few short videos, I think that playlist is your best bet. Anyway, let's jump right in. So in today's video, we're going to talk about strategic losing in Yu-Gi-Oh! Now, what does that mean? Well, this was a concept that I read about a long time ago from one of my favorite old school Yu-Gi-Oh! Pro players, Joji Orlando, and basically, strategic losing is when you lose a game so you can win the match. And that might sound a little counterintuitive, but I think in today's video, we're going to explore pretty in-depth why this actually works and some of the ways that you can apply this into a modern setting. So first off, I just want to mention that Yu-Gi-Oh! Is not like Magic. The games that you win and lose in a match don't actually matter. All that matters is whoever wins the match. This is different than Magic because from what I've seen, you actually have to report if it was a 2-0 or a 2-1 or a 1-2, anything along those lines, and it gives better tiebreakers to those that 2-0 their opponents. In Yu-Gi-Oh! This is not the case. If you've ever been to a bigger Yu-Gi-Oh! Tournament, you might know you don't write down who won which games. All you write down is who won the match, which means that as long as you win the match, it doesn't really matter if you lose a game, as long as you win two of them. And that's a pretty important distinction when we're talking about strategic losing in Yu-Gi-Oh! I think one of the best examples of this, and the first time that I really started thinking about this, is when your opponent was doing something with Wind Up Hunter. Now, this was way back in 2012, which seems like an entirely different game than it is right now, but Wind Up Hunter was part of the Wind Up loop. Basically, your opponent would take at least 3 cards out of your hand, sometimes 4, sometimes even 5 cards out of your hand on the first turn, assuming you didn't have a hand trap. That was pretty crazy, and for a lot of decks back then, it was pretty much impossible to come back from. You can know by looking at your opening hand if you have a 1 card or 2 card combination to actually deal with losing all the other cards. And what would happen in a lot of competitive settings is when your opponent would start that wind up combo, when they activated the first Wind Up Hunter, if you evaluated your hand and said, you know what, I can't win this game, let's move on to game 2, that would be super extremely beneficial to you. Now, why would that be beneficial? Well, because if you scoop before your opponent resolves the hunter, because you can scoop at any time, your opponent now doesn't know what you're playing. They didn't know if you were playing a wind-up deck yourself. You might have been playing Inzectors or Dino Rabbit or some rogue strategy. The value of information is so ridiculously high in card games that actually just scooping a game where you couldn't win anyway is super important if you want to win the entire match. And that was a pretty common strategy back then. Now, if your hand could actually combat the field and losing your entire hand, that was fine. I guess you could continue to play the game. Maybe you were playing something like Chaos Dragons that could make use of the cards that were being discarded. But in general, if you were playing a deck that could not come back from that, it was much better to actually just scoop game 1 and go to game 2 so that your opponent didn't know what you were playing. Of course, windups have been out of the metagame for many years now, so let's apply this to a more modern example. In today's metagame, you are very likely to face either GOUKI or Spirals, and both those decks can open some pretty ridiculous boards, assuming you don't draw a Droll Lockbird or an Ash Blossom on a very specific card, or perhaps even a Ghost Reaper and Winter Cherries. If you don't open the specific hand trap that is good against their opening hand, many times you are left facing down in a ridiculous, insane board with extra links, in some cases Spiral Sleeper, just all sorts of stuff with Firewall Dragon and Tri-Gate Wizard, and it's really extremely difficult for a lot of decks to actually out that board, and that's perfectly fine. Those decks definitely aren't unbeatable, and they aren't even really the best decks of the format, but you might be facing down that deck going second with your deck that is maybe like Altergeist, a deck that's very normal summon reliant and isn't that great at breaking boards. Now your opponent's combo is going to take anywhere from 5 to 10 minutes depending how fast fast or slow they're playing. Hopefully it only takes about 5 minutes. That's not ridiculously long because there are a lot of steps in that combo, so it's understandable if it takes them a few minutes. But if it takes anywhere from 5 to 10 minutes, it's pretty important, if you know that you can't break that board, to just scoop the first game. And that might sound a little crazy because you're saying, well, what if I draw the perfect combination to out that board? Well, luckily you know what 5 of your 6 cards are going to be, and you can know if that 6th card is going to help break their board. Just say to yourself while your opponent's doing their combo, is there any card in my deck that I can draw right now that'll actually out my opponent's board? If there isn't an option, well, there's no reason really to watch your opponent sort of play solitaire. Just move on to game 2, and once again, you have the strategic advantage as against windups, where your opponent now doesn't know what deck you're playing. They don't know if you're playing Skystriker Trickstars or Altergeist or Dinosaurs. They have no idea what you're playing, so they don't know how to properly side deck, and a lot of times that can work in your favor if they draw improperly side decked cards in game 2 that they had no idea were not going to be good against your deck. Now, there is one case that I should mention where you want to let your opponent do their combo, and that's if you notice your opponent is pretty inexperienced with their combo deck, like GOUKI or Spirals. Those decks are fairly complicated. You have to know a lot of different steps to actually end with those boards. So if you notice that your opponent is playing a little weird and you notice that they're making plays that your other opponents haven't with those decks, maybe in that case you can let them keep making their board because they might screw it up at the end. Maybe they don't end with a Trigate, maybe the Trigate isn't co-linked 3 times. There's all sorts of things that you can prepare for if you know your opponent isn't going to end with the optimal board, but that isn't likely the case at a regional or YCS, because you can assume that if your opponent is taking those decks to those events, that they're probably pretty experienced with the deck and they know what they're doing. This all matters even more because of the new end of match procedures. If you don't know, basically now when you go into time, the game pretty much immediately ends, and whoever has the most life points wins the match. And that means that not letting your opponent waste time in game 1 playing solitaire is a huge advantage to smaller decks like Altergeist that don't have a lot of crazy power plays. They can't do damage super fast. They're more board control decks, even like the Skystriker deck list, not the Trickstar one. That one's obviously really good in time, but the conventional Skystriker list is more of a control deck, not so much an OTK deck, because we don't have Crystron Needle Fiber in our game right now, and that means that those decks have a lot harder time actually dealing damage, so they want as many turns as possible to actually play the game. So wasting time in game 1 letting your opponent set up a huge board that you know you can't break is a pretty bad idea when you go into time and you realize, man, I could have had that extra 5 minutes. This also matters a ton when, let's say your game 1 is 30 minutes. It takes a full 30 minutes. You won the die roll, so you won game 1. Going into game 2, you're going second, and you notice there's only 10 minutes left on the clock. Now your opponent sets up a pretty good board, not like a crazy board, but a pretty good one, and your hand is about suboptimal. Now you could certainly play out the game if you wanted to, but there's a very high chance that that game will take all of that 10 minutes, which means that if you don't win that game, and once again you have a suboptimal hand, not an optimal one, if it goes into time, you're very likely to actually lose that game, resulting in a draw. So one thing you can do, especially if you won game 1 and now you're in game 2, so you're going second, is you can actually just scoop game 2 and immediately go to game 3. Your opponent can only take up to 3 minutes to side deck for game 3. So if you scoop at 10 minutes, you know that you'll start game 3 at around 7 minutes, maybe 6.5 minutes. So you'll have 6.5 minutes to play, but more importantly, you'll actually be going first, which means that you have a huge upper hand in those matches. You can set up a board first, you can hopefully do damage first, and you can hopefully win that match because of it. That's just another case, not a game 1 example, but a game 2 example when your game 1 takes way too long, where you can strategically lose to make sure you win the match. Now, there could be a scenario where you actually would rather just draw the match instead of win or lose the match, and that can be a pretty big deal. In that case, yeah, just play the game 2 and try your best, but if you draw, it's not that big a deal. I know there are some cases where a loss is way worse than a draw. I mean, I guess in every case a draw is better than a loss, but there's some cases where you're a little unsure if you can actually win that game 3, and in those cases, you might as well just try to play it out and get a draw, but those are few and far between. I think in in general, when you can go first game 3, you're probably going to win as long as you know what you're doing. In conclusion, there's two really important ways that you can strategically lose your Yu-Gi-Oh games in order to gain an advantage in the overall match. The first one that I talked about was withholding information from your opponent just so that you can move on in the next games without your opponent knowing exactly what you're playing. I also should mention really quickly, you don't have to reveal all of your back row when your opponent wins game 1. I see that way too often where an opponent just flips up all their back row when I beat them in game 1, and you might be giving away tech choices or information to your opponent that you really didn't need to give them in the first place, so just don't do that. That's more of an aside. But in general, withholding information from your opponent is a fantastic way to get an upper hand. Obviously, if something's public knowledge, you have to tell your opponent the truth, but just giving your opponent deck information because you want to see them play out their field and you want to try to break it, even though you're pretty sure you can't break it, that's not a good idea. And the second way you can use this is to gain time because of the new end of match procedures being so detrimental to so many different decks out there. Pretty much everything except Trickstars took a hit with these new end of match procedures. By scooping a game earlier than you would have in the past, you can definitely help yourself by not going into time and hopefully winning that match. Anyway though, hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. Like I said, make sure to go check out that playlist if you haven't seen those videos. I really do think those are some of the highest quality videos on my channel. They're not the most watched ones, but I do think they are incredibly important for someone looking to get into competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! And look at a video from a broad sense, not so much a specific card sense like the Why Nobody Plays series. Anyway though, thanks so much for watching. I'll see you guys later.